Hello, welcome to my channel. You might be wondering why I have my mountain bike here and my BMX bike here in this video. Well, I was chatting on the web with some other riders and we got to this discussion about handlebar height, and people seem to be really confused at why you might run a higher rise bar or lower rise bar or something like that. So I'm going to start with these two bikes and then try to describe it as best as I can on what the benefits are and the drawbacks are on different height bars. This video might be a little long, so we'll see.
Windy again. Love this trail. Woo. Might have to overshoot some of these this time.
Here we go, Chad.
Oh yes. Can't believe I just did that.
Okay, so the first factors I want to talk about are wheel size, suspension, and handlebar height being kind of the main combination you got to think about. So what's going to affect how high your handlebars are, just starting out, before we start talking about rider position, we're just talking about bike type. The more suspension you have and the bigger front wheel you have, the taller your frame is going to be. So this is 160 millimeter suspension, 29-inch wheel, and so the starting point is going to be way up here, and then now we're going to have some spacers, whatever, stem, and then handlebars. So that, in the case like this is actually relatively low. Now, the reason I have my BMX bike here is, if you think of a bike like this, now we've got a really small wheel, 20-inch wheel, no suspension, and a BMX handlebar is going to be a lot taller. So a lot of people might look at a BMX bike and think, wow, that's a small bike. Well, really it isn't. This is a pretty big bike. It's a 21.25 top tube, which is in the Pro XL category for BMX bikes. And this is a 28.5-inch rise bar, which I believe comes out to, almost 230 millimeters or somewhere around that rise, versus over here where we got a 30 millimeter rise. So I just brought the BMX bike out here to show kind of the biggest comparison between going small wheel to large wheel and suspension, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here with different bikes. So let's go ahead and pull out another bike and talk about this same comparison. Okay, this is going to be a little bit closer matchup because I went to a bigger wheel in the front. So this is a 26-inch wheel, and even though this isn't a suspension fork, it is suspension corrected for 100 millimeters. So think of this as a 100 millimeter fork, and this is a 160 millimeter fork. So 26-inch wheel, 100 millimeter fork frame, and now we're starting at this point. So I run 80 millimeter rise bars on my bike. This is my dirt jump bike. So 80 millimeter rise bars, because the front end's a bit lower and I want more handlebar, and I'll explain why in a minute. So the first thing to think about when we talk about handlebar rise is what is going on with the front end of the bike. What's the wheel size, what's the suspension travel, things like that. Like if you get to a downhill bike that's got like 200 millimeters or 205 millimeters, whatever they have nowadays, of suspension travel, that's going to raise this front end even higher. So do you really want like a big rise bar on a downhill bike? Probably not. You almost want like a flat bar. You see a lot of downhill bikes they have maybe a 10 millimeter rise or something like that. Rarely do you see a super tall bar. And then in this case, this is my Ripmo AF. I actually got a little bit taller bar than what came stock on this bike. And this is where I'm going to get more into detail about rider preference. So unfortunately, I gave away the bars that originally came on this bike, but I do have these, which actually came off my fat bike, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I did go to a 30 millimeter rise bar on the Ripmo AF because it had, I think the bars were even less rise than this. This is, I believe, like a 15 millimeter rise or something. So they were almost flat. I think they had only about a 10 millimeter rise. So I wanted to raise up the front end. And the reason for that is because for me, it allows me to pull up the front end easier. It shifts my weight back a little bit more. So it's really going to depend on what characteristics you want out of your bike, as well as how your bike is designed. All those factors play in on this, and this is where things get a little complicated. And I'm going to talk a little bit about bike geometry, and if you're interested, stay tuned. Okay, there's many factors that are involved when it comes to bike geometry, and bikes have evolved, especially mountain bikes, have evolved a lot over the last just even 10 years. They've gotten pretty extreme in the geometry lately. BMX bikes, not so much. I mean, the materials have changed, other things, but as far as geometry goes, BMX bikes have had similar geometry for, since probably the later 90s. But mountain bikes have really aggressively evolved. And so the factors that are going to really matter in how your bike rides are going to have to do with bottom bracket height, which is usually measured in the form of BB drop. BB drop is how far does the bottom bracket drop from the rear axle height. Now when we talk about that, we're talking a parallel line between the rear axle and the front axle, and then how far is the center of the crank spindle down from that. That'll be your BB drop. And depending on bikes, some bikes will even have this higher than the axle, so it might have a positive bottom bracket height. That's not common on a bike like this with full suspension and 29er wheels. So the other factor that's really going to matter is what's called chainstay length. So it's center of bottom bracket spindle to center of rear axle. And what is this length? And again, with bikes, it gets more challenging because as we go to a 29er wheel, you just don't have a lot of space in here. So that's why you see a lot of these curved tubes like this, and this is opened up, and this is machined to allow for the wheel to be as far forward as it possibly can be and still allow the suspension to do its thing so nothing rubs or hits. So the engineering of suspension and bikes and everything is way more complicated than a lot of us know. And it's mostly because they're trying to shorten the rear end and get the suspension travel and all those things without things running into each other and stuff, all while still trying to give you a good solid pedaling platform. So DW link on this, I actually like it, but this isn't the only good suspension design. People will brag about different things, but this is about handlebar height. I'm just kind of basically going over geometry. So the next factor, once you get the rear end in play, chainstay length, bottom bracket height, things like that. Seat tube angle kind of plays a role, but mostly for stuff related to geometry, we're going to pay more attention to what's going on when you're standing and riding, especially for a rider like me who likes to jump a lot, pull up the front wheel, do drops, things like that. I'm a much more technical rider, so the seated position is important for some things like climbing and stuff, But for when you're standing and riding and doing technical stuff, where the seat is isn't all that important. So there is a seat tube angle. Modern bikes tend to have it a lot steeper now because they want riders to be more forward when seated and climbing and stuff like that and doing stuff. But for anything technical, get out of the saddle and get into a standing position. So for those of you that are newer riders, you really need to learn to be out of the saddle and in this attack position. So I have that in some of my videos. So we'll move on to geometry. So the next thing is top tube length. Well, we can't measure top tube like we do BMX bikes, which would be from here, center of seat tube to center of here. We can, but due to all the angles and all the complexity going on, the best way to measure top tube length is center of steer tube and a parallel line coming back to center of seat tube, so somewhere up here, and that's going to be called your effective top tube. So that's always going to be an accurate measurement regardless of what's going on with the frame, super low, tall, whatever. You're always going to be able to measure that effective top tube. So that's the number you want to be looking at, not actual top tube length. And effective top tube is going to determine what we call your cockpit, like how far out are the handlebars going to be, how close in are they going to be, things like that. I'm 5'7", and I like to have at least 23 inches, and generally a little longer than that nowadays, effective top tube. On a size small, this happens to be a medium, so I actually have a little bit longer cockpit, and then compensating with shorter stem. But so there's a lot going on here, but the longer your bike gets, the more front end is out there in front of you. So like if you're a really steep descent, that's actually a benefit. But when you're flat and you want to pull up the front wheel, the longer your bike is, the harder the front wheel is going to be to pull up. Bikes have gotten really long, wheelbases have gotten longer, cockpits have gotten longer, stems have gotten shorter. And there's a reason for all of this. So the shorter stem is compensating for the longer frame. The longer frame is putting your front wheel out there more, making it safer to do descents or coming over things, and even going off a jump if you happen, or drop if you happen to land front wheel heavy. Since it's out there more, you have less risk of flipping over. So that's important. Modern bikes that have a long effective top tube do not run a longer stem on it. Just don't do it. I consider that extremely dangerous, actually, especially if you're going to be doing more technical riding. The longer your stem is, the more you put your body over the front wheel, and that's not what you want. So that's going to move us all the way through but this geometry stuff. The one thing that you can actually change relatively easily is your handlebar height and what kind of differences that makes. So let's get into that now that I talked a little bit about geometry. All right, so here I am sitting on my bike. I'll probably use this wall to prop myself up so I can show this a little better. The height of the handlebar is going to do a few things. If my bar is low, it's going to shift my body down and forward. So lower bar does this to your body, higher bar does this to your body, right? So imagine my bar is up here, I'm going to be like virtually upright. As my post is all the way down, so obviously if my seat was up, it would hike me forward a little bit, but just for conceptual purposes, the higher you go, the more upright you're going to be. The lower you go, the more leaned forward you're going to be. So where you want your body is really a rider preference thing. So if we think about climbing and cross-country racing and things like that, they generally want their bars lower. for that is it's more aerodynamic for one. It's aggressive pedaling, riding position. Think road bike, drop bar, things like that. But the disadvantage of cross-country bikes is they start to get a little challenging to ride in technical terrain, because you're kind of over the front wheel and you're down and you're in this low position. They are, if you look at modern cross-country bikes, they are starting to evolve. Slacker head tube angles, higher front ends. I know there's this talk about some adjustable stem that Shimano's talking about. I don't know, seems kind of crazy, but cross-country bikes, they generally want lower front ends, and it's for that really aggressive pedaling, power position. Climbing is a big thing, because if you're lower, you're climbing, it's harder for your front wheel to come up, things like that. As we get into trail bikes and enduro bikes, and then even more aggressive bikes like park bikes and downhill bikes, you want your front end higher. It doesn't necessarily mean you want your bars higher, because as I talked about earlier, the more suspension, the taller the whole front end of the bike is going to be. So you might have to offset that a little bit by a lower bar. So coming to the reason why I went with a probably about 20 millimeters higher rise on this bike is simply because I felt the front end was a little too low, and it was a little harder to pull up the front wheel than I really liked on this bike, for me. And so I went with a little bit higher rise bar, but not too extreme, because as you saw on my dirt jump bike, that's 80 millimeter rise bar. Well, putting an 80 millimeter rise bar on here would bring me way up in this kind of not ideal riding position. So let's lean against this wall and talk a little bit about handlebar height. So when I'm standing and I'm in this attack position, if my bar is lower and I want to shift my weight back, it's harder to get my weight back. The higher bar that I get, and you'll notice that as I adjust my bars to line up with the angle of the fork, so I tilt them back. And the reason for that is because then when I'm back here, I have this direct pull on the front wheel to get my front wheel up. And if my front end was lower, to throw my weight back like that is way more effort, and it's harder to pull up the front wheel. So that's the primary reason why I raised my bars a little bit, for it to be easier to lift the front wheel. I'm not a super tall rider, so I don't have this huge torso, and I'm not way up here raising the center of gravity of my bike, so I can just easily leverage the front wheel up. I'm shorter, so I need all the help I can get by raising the front end. So that might be deceiving to some people that are thinking, well, shorter riders should have the lower bar. Well, that's not necessarily always the case. It's more about body position than it is anything else. And so it gets complicated, which is kind of why I wanted to do this video, because it got really confusing in that conversation about bar height and why people prefer different ways. But I'm talking about me as a more aggressive, rider who likes to jump, do drops, bunny hop, wheelies, manuals, things like that. The taller the handlebar is, the easier it is going to be to do those things to a point. Obviously getting too high is just not going to work out, because then I'm like way back, right? So this feels good to me. This is where I like it. And my dirt jump bike actually had 60 millimeter or 50 or 60 millimeter rise, and I actually raised them up to 80 millimeters. So I tend to, from a stock bike, I tend to like to go up a little bit taller than the stock offering. So let's talk about kind of the downsides and why you might not want a higher front end. So all bikes are drastically different. As you go up to a bigger size bike, like this is a size medium, I'm right on the cusp between a small and a medium in the Ripmo AF. Every bike manufacturer is different. I almost always ride a small. This is actually the first time that I've ridden a medium full suspension bike, and it was kind of, I wanted to see what it's like to be on that upper cusp, above where my measurements come into play, because on their website I could go either way. I could have gone with a smaller or medium. So the drawbacks of having a taller bar are going to more or less have a lot more to do with climbing than anything. Once you're climbing, if your weight's back more or you're up higher, the front end's going to want to come up easier. So when you start to power into the pedal, the front end wants to come up. What I do to offset that is I bend my elbows. Like if I'm just climbing something steep, instead of being out here like I normally am, I bend my elbows in and drop my chest. And this is seated climbing, so I have my post all the way up. I'm forward, and I just do this. Really simple adjustment. One of the disadvantages of that is if you really are going for climbing performance, the moment I start doing this, I compress my lungs and my diaphragm and things like that, and it's a little bit harder to breathe. For me, I don't care because I'm not doing cross-country racing. My climbing is simply so I can get to the top so I can do the fun downhill stuff. I'm not in a huge hurry when I'm climbing. I'm not trying to get fastest lap times or anything like that. But it's definitely something that you want to think about when you're thinking about what type of bar you want, or even what kind of bike you want, right? So that's really, in my eyes, the only drawback. Coming full circle to some of the benefits, especially for older riders or riders that have back problems or something, the higher rise bar, when you're seated, now that I have my post all the way up, when you're seated and climbing, puts you up more, and being like this, with a lower bar, puts a lot of weight on your hands, shifts your weight forward. I feel like it strains the back a little more. As you're more upright, it's just a more comfortable position. Think beach cruiser, right? You definitely don't want to be perfectly upright. Or on a commuter bike, you might like this. You kind of want a semi-aggressive position, but the higher rise does give you a little more comfort in just the all-around pedaling form. So if you're doing a lot of miles and distance, maybe having a taller front end might be a better option. So that's pretty much covers handlebar rise and why you'll see different rise bars on bikes. When you see stock bikes, they're gonna come, most bikes almost nowadays that I see have like literally a 10 millimeter rise. They're pretty low. I highly recommend you try the stock feel, but if you start, if you have a hard time pulling up the front end, things like that, definitely get a little bit higher rise bar. Smaller riders, smaller frames, a lot of times women, I feel like they really struggle because they just don't have that pure upper body strength. And so going with a little bit higher rise bar might be hugely beneficial in getting, because the more weight you can take advantage of and transfer, the easier it is to do things versus having to just muscle things. So that's another reason to possibly try a higher rise bar. One of the things I'm going to say right off the top is don't get on somebody else's bike with a higher rise bar unless it's the exact same model and size of your bike. And then try that and be like, oh, I like the higher rise bar. Going back to what I started this video with, all bikes' geometries are vastly different. So we don't know what the stack height is on that other bike. So that might not actually be a good way to test to see if you like a taller bar. Getting on somebody else's bike with a taller bar, like if you jumped on my dirt bike and was like, oh yeah, I like these 80 millimeter rise bars on this bike, and then thought, oh, I'm gonna get 80 millimeter rise bars for my full suspension, enduro bike. No, you just can't like do that. You definitely, and I know it's a cost thing or whatever, want to put bars on your bike and try them out. Maybe there's some shops out there that'll actually let you do that and demo it before you make a purchase. Sometimes that's the benefit of being able to work with a bicycle shop versus ordering online. Me personally, I try things, and then if they don't work out, I can either give them away or sell them or things like that. So I do ordering online quite a bit. P&W, you can order right from their site. But that pretty much just sums up the whole handlebar thing. One of the most important things is there's a lot of opinionated people out there. I'm actually one of them. But you definitely don't want to just be told by somebody who's super opinionated that this is the way it's got to be. It's something that you got to figure out for yourself and what works best for you, and that's why you kind of got to try different things to get it just right. I've been riding for a very long time, so I pretty much know instantly when I get on a bike what I want different, or if I don't even like the bike, right? But not all people are to that place yet, and so you kind of have to play around with it, and it's going to be a little bit of a struggle. But hopefully this video will help you understand what's going on up here and kind of the whole bike geometry in relationship to what's going on here. Cool. That was a bit long-winded, but I just kind of wanted to get all the details out there for you. It's kind of how I do things, is I try to put as much information from my brain into these videos. And I'm sure I overlook some things sometimes, but I try not to. I really appreciate you supporting my channel. Please like and subscribe. And here's my fat bike. I went from a 10 millimeter rise to a 40 millimeter rise spank spoon bar, and I threw a dropper on it. Adding this handlebar, like, it changed this bike completely. Like, I can now just shred on this bike. And you might have seen my video recently of me jumping my bike using the MTB hopper. I now am in love with this bike simply because of that. Mainly how it changed how the bike feels and handles completely. And adding a dropper is just something I have to have on pretty much all my bikes, except the commuter, of course. Don't really need a dropper on that bike. So, yes, fat bike is awesome.